Hi, this is Professor Unmack, and I want to talk a little bit about federalism. Um, and specifically, I want to go over some of the ways that federalism allows states to act as what we call policy laboratories. So, under federalism, there's no one size fits all solution to every problem that arises in our government. Right? We don't allow Congress to just tell the states exactly how they have to approach every single issue. States have a lot of power to experiment with different ways of doing things. And that's one of the benefits of federalism. States can tailor their policies to what makes sense to them in their state, right? Some states are more liberal than others. Some states are more conservative. And so the legislatures in those states enact policies that reflect the political culture in that state. Now, some things states are not allowed to do. If something is prohibited by the US Constitution, for example, denying people the right to vote based on their race is illegal. So a state couldn't adopt a policy that says only white people can vote. A state can't adopt a policy that says only women can vote because the 19th Amendment to the Constitution says you can't deny people the right to vote based on their gender. So there are some things that are the federal government's responsibility. So the federal government is responsible for setting immigration policy, for example. But there are a lot of things that the states have the power to experiment with. And I want to talk about three of those. I should point out, too, that we're watching this play out with regard to the state responses to COVID-19, right? Some states, especially states that had a lot of cases right at the very beginning, had stricter policies about shutting down businesses and limiting gatherings, et cetera. Other states took a more less of a strict approach and said, we're not going to mandate that people wear masks. We're not going to mandate that businesses close down. We're going to sort of wait and see what happens. And then as the disease progresses, states can change their policies. As things get worse in a state, they can impose more restrictions or not, depending on the state. As states get better, they can review some of those restrictions and open things back up. For example, El Dorado County is now allowing hair salons to be open. So I just got my hair cut a couple of weeks ago. But the three policy issue areas that I want to talk about specifically in this PowerPoint are voting rights for felons, the minimum wage, and direct democracy. These are three things where you can see distinct differences between states in terms of how they approach the law. And so I thought they'd serve as kind of interesting illustrations of kind of federalism in action. Voting rights for felons, whoa, that was weird. Voting rights for felons has gotten to be more controversial as the years have gone past in recent years. When I first started teaching a little over 20 years ago, we didn't really talk very much about the laws regarding felons voting. But as our country has become more aware of the disparity in our sentencing laws and in policing procedures and in the number of people and the types of people who are being incarcerated, there's been a lot of talk about the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system on especially young Black men and the number of people of color relative to the proportion of people of color in the population who are sentenced to prison sentence rather than probation or having charges dropped and that kind of thing. It's becoming a much more important political battle as we, as a country, are starting to turn our attention to social justice reform and police reform in general. So it's been getting a lot more attention politically as an issue. One of the places you can get information about how states approach the law in their state with regard to felons voting is a website called procon.org. This is an organization that has research briefs on all sorts of issues that people care about. It's a really good place to go if you are writing a paper and you want to get some background information and some really good links to good academic information. So, now I've gone away from my page that I was in. Let's see. I'll see if I can just go back to it. Okay, so let's go back to this page about felons voting. This is there's a lot of information on this page, but one of the things that they have is a nice handy chart about different state laws. And so if you look at this in particular, you can see that different states have different policies with regard to whether people can vote while they're in prison. Only 2 states, Maine and Vermont, allow people to vote from prison. And all of the other states have some sort of policy in place that says, look, while you're in prison, you can't vote. But once a person is out of prison, they get the right to vote back under certain circumstances. You can see in some states, primarily fairly conservative states, there are policies in place to deny people the right to vote permanently for certain kinds of crimes. Usually those are violent felonies or felonies against children, etc. Other states allow people to get their right to vote back, but only after they have served their prison sentence and their parole. And there are 19 states that say you can't vote if you're on probation. So if you look at California, for example, California allows people to vote after they have served their prison and their parole, but we don't place restrictions on people who are on probation. So different states have different policies with regard to whether or not somebody can vote while they're in prison. So you can see that play out. Let's see if I can get back to the recording. Hopefully this is working. So that's one issue area. I wanted to point out that on the ballot this fall in California, one of the features of direct democracy that we're going to be voting on in California is a proposition called Proposition 17, which would allow people to vote while they're on parole. It would remove the restriction that says you can't vote until you've completed your parole. So once a person has completed his or her prison sentence, if this ballot measure passes in November, they would get the right to vote back even while they're on parole. So California is thinking about changing its policy with regard to felons voting. The second thing I wanted to look at is how minimum wage laws differ around the country. So this is data that comes from the U.S. Department of Labor. So it's a federal government agency, and obviously because it's the Department of Labor, they're concerned and interested in minimum wages. So they have a handy dandy table, and it includes it used to include a map. Used to have a little map, but we'll have to just look at this. So you can see that in these states on the left-hand column here, these states have minimum wages that are higher than the federal minimum wage of $7.25. So, for example, California's minimum wage, $12 an hour, and you can see that lots of states have decided, 29 states, have decided that the minimum wage is too low. Now, some states have only raised the minimum wage a little bit, like West Virginia, only raised the minimum wage a little bit. And then there are some states where the minimum wage is the same as, the state law says that the minimum wage is the same as the federal minimum wage, $7.25. Then there are some states where the state government itself, Alabama, Louisiana, et cetera, has not put anything in law about minimum wage, which means that they default to the federal minimum wage. So states can't set their minimum wage lower than the federal minimum wage, but they can set it higher than the federal minimum wage. And so you can see that some states have done that. Let's see. Go back to the PowerPoint. The last thing that I wanted to talk about with regard to federalism is what we call direct democracy. So direct democracy is the ability of states to enact laws or amendments to their constitution without going through the legislature to get that done, right? So if you want a law passed in the state of California, generally a member of the state legislature, the California Assembly or the California Senate will propose the bill. It goes through the committee process, the legislature votes on it. If they pass it, it goes to the governor. If the governor signs it, it becomes a law. Direct democracy allows people to bypass that process and put things before the voters directly. So the voters themselves are acting as if they are lawmakers. And most states have some form of direct democracy. There's only one state, Delaware, that only has a tiny little bit of direct democracy, but most states have various forms of direct democracy. And there are lots of different kinds of direct democracy. Let me just give you a brief overview. So there's what we call initiative, which is something that's put on the ballot by the voters themselves, by the people themselves. And that's called an initiative. So if the people of California want to enact a specific policy, a group can collect signatures and get that initiative placed on the ballot. There are some provisions, like in California state law, we have some provisions of direct democracy that require the legislature to put things before the voters rather than allowing the legislature to make decisions directly. So, for example, if the California legislature would like to see the California Constitution amended, the legislature itself can propose a constitutional amendment to the California Constitution. But in order for that to become part of the California Constitution, the legislature would have to place that measure before the voters and let the voters decide whether they want to amend the California Constitution or not. Another type of direct democracy is what we call referendum. And this is a type of direct democracy that allows the citizens of the state, the voters in the state, to overturn a law that's put in place by the state legislature. So if the California state legislature, for example, passes a law that says, we're going to make the minimum wage $100 an hour. Well, if people didn't like that law, they could collect signatures and put that law on the ballot, and then the voters would get to decide if they want to allow that law to stay in place. That's what we call referendum. And then the other common type of direct democracy is what we call recall, which is the ability of the people to essentially fire an elected official before their term is up. So if this only applies to state and local officials, it doesn't apply to members of Congress or we can't recall the president, for example. But if there's a member of the California State Assembly, for example, and the people in that member's district don't like the job that member is doing, well, the assembly term is 2 years, but they don't have to wait until 2 years are up. If they really don't like the job that person is doing, they could initiate a process for recalling that person from office before their term is up. And that's part of direct democracy in California. So this is the type of direct democracy we have in California. What we call initiative are proposals that are put forth by the citizens. So they're initiated by the citizens themselves. That could be a new law. That could be an amendment to the California Constitution. It could also be a bond measure. So a bond measure is a measure that allows the state of California to essentially borrow money. We use bonds to build schools, to build prisons, to do all kinds of construction, to fund parks and that kind of thing. It's money that has to be paid back, but citizens can initiate that process through the initiative process. It's a fairly complex process. It involves collecting signatures from registered voters and then submitting those signatures to the Secretary of State's office. And if enough signatures are gathered, then the initiative will be put on the ballot. If the group proposing the law, constitutional amendment, or bond doesn't get enough signatures, then it doesn't go on the ballot. The second type of direct democracy that we have in California is what's called the referendum. And that, again, is that voters can overturn laws passed by the state legislature. Sometimes the legislature does things that one particular group of people or even a really large group of people think that the legislature shouldn't have done. And again, if they can collect enough signatures from registered voters, they could have that law placed on the ballot so that the voters could decide, well, do we want to keep that law or do we want to get rid of that law? And then we have recall as well. In California, we can kick someone out of office before their term is up. The most famous example of that in California was when the California voters recalled the sitting governor at the time, a guy by the name of Gray Davis, and replaced him with Arnold Schwarzenegger as governor. The last type of direct democracy that I just want to point out is legislative proposals. This gets a little bit complicated because these are sometimes referred to as referenda, but they're a different kind of direct democracy. The California state legislature cannot amend the California Constitution. They can propose amendments, but only the people of California can change the Constitution of California. So if the California state legislature wants to amend the California Constitution, they can propose it, but it has to go before their voters. Same thing with bond measures. The California legislature can write bond measures. We should borrow, sell $10 billion worth of bonds to build new community college facilities. Woo-hoo. But the California legislature can't put that bond into law. They can place it before the voters, and then the voters would vote whether they want to spend the money that way. I want to take you to the Secretary of State's website. The California Secretary of State is the elected official who is responsible for California state election law and keeping the state's records of things. And so they have a section at the California Secretary of State's office about elections, and you can get the official voter information guide for the upcoming election. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because you can see what's on the ballot. So there are lots of propositions. These propositions are California direct democracy in action, and you can see that there are lots of them on the ballot this time. There are 11, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I'm not very good at math. The ones that you're seeing a lot of television commercials on are about Prop 15, which would increase taxes mostly on the wealthy and corporations to fund colleges and education. We're hearing a lot about Proposition 22, which is a initiative that would exempt companies like Uber and other ride-sharing kinds of places, kinds of businesses, from a current law that says the California legislature passed a law that restricts the types of companies that can use contracted employees, and this would exempt rideshare app companies from that, so they could continue to have people drive for their company without having to pay them a specific type of wage, or medical benefits and that kind of thing. So those are the two that you're hearing the most about. I already mentioned that there's a constitutional amendment proposed to the California Constitution that would change our policy with regard to voting rights for people who have completed a prison term. You'll notice this one is a legislative constitutional amendment. That means it was proposed by the California legislature and is now coming before the voters to see if we want to put that onto the into the California Constitution. Proposition 15 is an initiative constitutional amendment, which means it was initiated by citizens, not by the California legislature. And you can see the same thing is here with this is an initiative statute, this is an initiative statute, initiative statute, initiative statute, initiative statute. There is one referendum on the ballot, and it has to do with bail and how people are treated pre-trial. And so it's a law that's on the books, and California voters have a chance to decide whether they want to keep that law on the books or not. So that's how direct democracy is playing out in this upcoming election. There's a lot of things for voters to vote on. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to go back to our recording, the PowerPoint presentation. It's not showing me that right now. Here we go. Sorry about that. If I do a narrated PowerPoint, I can't use links. I can't get onto the internet and use links with a narrated PowerPoint. So I'm using a program called Camtasia to try and capture it, and it's not as easy as it probably should be. Anyway, that's all I had to say about those 3 examples of federalism in action.